Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there is a growing and there's a rare consensus among Western lawmakers and world leaders that the atrocities committed by ISIS against the minorities under its control constitute the crime of genocide. The U.S. Congress, the British Parliament, the European Parliament, the Council of Europe, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, the U.S. Holocaust Museum, and the International Association of Genocide Scholars have preceded us in making this determination. Like John Kerry, Hillary Clinton, and Pope Francis, these institutions have recognized this crime by its rightful name: genocide. So what should Canada do? The facts demand that we call this genocide. Our obligations under the Genocide Convention demand that we call this genocide. In fact, if we don't, we betray not only the victims and the cause of justice, but we fail Canadians who expect us as MPs to do better than our predecessors who sat in these very seats in addressing a crime that was rightly described by Winston Churchill as the crime of crimes. I believe, Mr. Speaker, that I'm not alone in this House in carrying a sense of shame over the silence that resonated all too often in the Western world and in this chamber as previous genocides were perpetrated. I therefore must take issue with those who have suggested that this motion, like those that were passed in the US and in Europe, is somehow beyond Parliament's purview, and that recognizing genocide for what it is strictly a legal determination to only be made by a court. Today, the member from West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country said that genocide isn't for us to decide. The Minister of Foreign Affairs also said that genocide isn't for us to determine, and they are both so very, very wrong. It's true that an individual accused of this crime can only be convicted in a court of law. However, our obligation as parliamentarians and as Canadians under the Genocide Convention to punish the perpetrator of genocide was never meant to replace or impede our concurrent obligation to prevent genocide. Our obligation to prevent and to protect demands that parliaments like ours make a determination, an indictment of sorts, upon which our policies are to be predicated. Today, the member from Spadina Fort York said, and there's this sense that simply uttering a word is going to save a life, that simply uttering a word is going to suddenly bring transformative action on the ground. The member from Burlington said, it's times like these where it's compelling, when we see videos, when we see the images, to want to name what's happening. Then they went on to define why we shouldn't. Well, Mr. Speaker, we know that we cannot prevent what we cannot name. And we know this. And because we know this, their comments are cowardly and shameful. Waiting for a legal ruling that could be years away, if ever, before raising our voice as a country would simply add another shameful chapter to the history of reticence in the face of genocide which has plagued the last century. As noted by Diane Ortletcher, an expert on genocide at American University's Washington College of Law, one of the mistakes we have made in recent memory is to have performed legal gymnastics to avoid using the word genocide when describing real-time atrocities. This misses the point of the International Genocide Convention, which is, if you wait until it's legally certain that genocide has occurred, you've waited too long to prevent it. Genocide has a very specific legal threshold that is different than those required to determine whether an atrocity should be considered a crime against humanity or a war crime. It's a legal threshold that in the past has sometimes been difficult to prove, but today we have cell phones, we have video cameras, we have an instant news cycle, social media, YouTube, Periscope, and many other means to transmit information, and ISIS has used this to its disgusting advantage.
They're not hiding it.
Their genocidal actions have been widely documented and disseminated. Its genocidal actions are undeniable. Its genocidal actions are unabashed and open, and its guilt freely admitted and publicized and in numerous publications, including Debik, the official ISIS magazine. Mass graves have been uncovered. Documentaries of women in sexual slavery have been made. Yazidi women are being sold over the internet. What more proof does this government need? Furthermore, ISIS genocide is neither a crime or a tactic, but an ideal and a value of itself, and one that's espoused by this group. Secretary of State John Kerry put it succinctly and accurately. ISIS is genocidal by self-proclamation, by ideology, and by actions, in what it says, in what it believes, and in what it does, and he is right. The evidence has far exceeded the threshold for probable cause and the quotient of atrocity required for this determination. The first question today, asked to the Leader of the Opposition in moving this motion, was again by the member from West Vancouver's Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky country. I was blown away. The first question was, what responsibility does the Leader of the Opposition feel to the International Criminal Court? I'd ask her and my colleagues here, should that be our first concern?
Exactly.
Are we so down the path of moral relativism that we can't acknowledge that our responsibility, our first responsibility, should be to save the women who are at this very moment where we sit here arguing over semantics, being raped and tortured by ISIS? Our first responsibility should be to the tens of thousands who were trapped on Mount Sinjar and felt starvation and dehydration. It should be to those who can't reach refugee camps because they will be further persecuted. It should be to those who have nowhere to go and nowhere to turn. And if that is not our first responsibility and our first concern, then who are we as a country? Mr. Speaker, I know I have a couple of minutes left, and I have to take some time because I have 2 Yazidi women that have been in contact with me in Calgary. And they've been through so much, and they don't understand it when the government stands up and cannot conform to its obligations under the Genocide Convention of preventing genocide. And this is what they told me. Girls have jumped 2 stories, breaking her back while trying to escape. Many others were killed trying to escape. The Yazidis were all trapped at the top of the mountain. Many were betrayed by their neighbors to be captured or killed. All men are executed, except for young boys who are then brainwashed into being child suicide bombers, willing to return to destroy their previous communities. A woman refused to let go of her baby while being brutally raped, so they killed the baby in front of her and continued to rape her. The women, once rescued, are unable to go back into society because they are considered damaged goods, and recently their leader spoke out saying that the communities must accept the women, but they are still unwelcome. 150 women were put into one dark room for days with no water and no light bulb to be brought out a few at a time for short periods, only to be raped and abused by their captors. 270 Yazidi children won't come home because they are brainwashed by ISIS for suicide missions. Mr. Speaker, I have sadly concluded that up till now, the atrocities against these minorities have not adequately found their ways into the policy of the Western world, and only a tiny fraction of these communities have found their way onto Western shores. This is why rediscovering our sense of urgency has to start by beginning with calling these crimes genocide. It's a word that conveys a particular level of evil, of premeditation, of monstrosity, and it should never be blithely used. But it also must not be shied away from because of the sheer gravity of the world. Making this designation does not establish a hierarchy of suffering in the world of atrocities, but it does recognize a hierarchy of evil as defined by our laws and our most basic of values, a hierarchy that should be a critical component in defining our policy priorities. Mr. Speaker, we shouldn't be worried about what we need to do after we call this genocide. We should call it genocide and start getting that stuff done. Yeah. The Minister of Foreign Affairs just said in the House that supporting this motion would be playing politics and that it would create dangerous precedent. Yeah. I would argue that rather, voting against this by each member of the government as they stand there and vote against this would in fact do those exact things. Former President Bill Clinton has publicly expressed his deep regret on multiple occasions for not declaring the Rwandan slaughter as a genocide, and it would be a terrible error for us to make the same mistake. No number of future apologies, mournful eulogies, successful prosecutions will atone for and acquit us of the error of silence. Canada should not remain outside this extraordinary moment of consensus in the face of an extraordinary evil. I urge my colleagues to reconsider this, look in the bottom of their heart and figure out what's right, and to consider their votes based on these facts, irrespective of any other policy consideration. I urge my colleagues to consider why they are here. They're here to protect the people we serve and stand up for what is right. And I urge my colleagues to save many, many lives and support this motion.
Yeah.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
The members opposite seem to think that if you say genocide 3 times, spin around in a circle, click your heels, suddenly something stops. It's as empty a set of rhetorical arguments as the notion that saying get out of the Ukraine suddenly solved the crisis in that part of the world. The reality here is that Margaret Thatcher once said, if you want something said, choose a man. If you want something done, choose a woman. In this Parliament, it seems, if you want something said, choose the opposition. If you want something done, choose what the Liberal government is doing. And what we're doing is actually setting the stage for the prosecution and the end of this atrocities that we think are just as evil as anybody else in this House. And what we are trying to do, and what we hope the opposition will support, is a move to declare this a genocide legally under the conventions of the United Nations. But additionally, we are not waiting for that to take action. We are taking action specifically on the ground with an increased support for the people fighting to stop this. Would the members not agree that the action to stop this outweighs any word you could ever attach to the atrocities, all of which we denounce with them?
The Honourable Member for Calgary Nose Hill.
In 50 years, Mr. Speaker, when some future government stands here and apologizes to the world for inaction on this, I hope the member from Spadina Forks York's comment that if you call it genocide and you click your heels, that level of glibness and disgusting triviality of hundreds of thousands of people dying and being raped, that's how he treats it. I hope his constituents remember him for that comment.